I think God wanted to make the lessons in Job very applicable to my own personal life. And so Friday, after about 25 hours of study and having my lesson notes complete, I went to the computer and they were gone. And I thought, I don't have 25 hours to spend again between now and Tuesday. But the Lord has graciously brought most of it back to me, I guess the parts that He desired. That loss was nothing compared to what poor Job had. He had bereavement loss of all his children, financial loss of all his wealth, a wife who was no support at all, and friends who, instead of comforting him, criticized him. That's just a bummer. But he has wanted a conversation with God about this. And he's been talking, but God has been silent. And then in chapter 38, here we are to lesson 7. God, it's all a quote from God. I loved it. What does God's voice sound like? I don't know. That thunder is the word that is a biblical word. Job 37:5, Elihu said, God thunders with his voice. Moses heard the voice of God, and it came with lightning and thunder and trumpets, and he just said that were exceedingly loud. In an age where there was no amplification of sound, that was remarkable. And then Elijah heard the voice of God. Right after, he had a wind that broke rocks and an earthquake and a fire. But God did not thunder there. Who remembers what the still small voice of God spoke to him? And then Ezekiel is another one in Scripture who heard God speak, and he spoke out of a whirlwind or a tornado. So that was probably a lot like what Job heard. But in verse 1 of chapter 38, to whom is God specifically speaking? To Job. He's talking to Job. He's not talking to the friends or anyone else who may be listening. And what is the first thing he says? Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Whoops. Did anyone ever tell you you don't know what you're talking about? And how did you feel? But actually, I think much of the talk we do to God, He could say that to us. And then in verse 3, he says, gird up your loins like a man. That's a military command. Belt up your robes. Get ready to fight. Put on your weapons. Job, you and I are going one-on-one. I was amused to recall a story about Muhammad Ali, who was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world for many years, and he had no reservations about telling you that. He was on a commercial flight one time, and just before takeoff, he was still walking up and down the halls, the aisles, signing autographs and saying how wonderful he was. And a stewardess said, you need to sit down and put your seatbelt on. And he said, Superman don't need no seatbelt. And she said, Superman don't need no airplane. Sit down. You sit down and buckle up. That's kind of what God is saying. And he says, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer me. Now, the questions were easy. In the passage from 38 to 40, chapter 2, he asked Job 77 questions. That's a lot of questions, but it's about the world where Job has lived all of his days. Let's see how Job will do. Janice, I know you're like me. I thought that'd be 1.3 points every question if you were trying to make 100. And the first question is, where were you, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth? What's the obvious answer? Where was Job? He didn't exist. Oh, that's interesting. The foundations. What are the foundations of the world? Ancients believed the world existed on the back of elephants. I don't know what the elephants were standing on. Or on the back of swimming turtles. Actually, in the book of Job, Job has said himself, God hangs the earth upon nothing. How can you hang something on nothing? This is far beyond our thought process, isn't it? Hebrews 1:3 tells us how the earth is still hanging there. Jesus, God's Son, is on the throne of God, upholding all things by his word. That's what the earth is hanging on, the word of Christ at this moment. I've never seen that before. That was a blessing. And he says, verse 4, go ahead, tell me if you understand this. Speak to me about this. And verses 5 and 6, he said, who laid the measures of the earth? Who stretched the line? That's an old, like we use a tape measure. That's an old way of measuring. And what are the foundations fastened to? And who laid the cornerstone? I remember building our house. We came out to the pasture lot, and there were stakes. And then there were strings between the stakes. And then there was digging for a footer between the stakes. That's what the builder did. Can any man answer that question? Because obviously we were not there. If you're ever called upon to testify in court, you have to have been there. You have to have seen something. Or as I was schooled when I was called to court, it's fine to say I have no independent memory of that event. But what happened when God laid the cornerstone of earth? Look at verse 7. The morning stars sang, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Who do you think that refers to? Who was alive when God started creating the earth? The three persons of God and the angels. And how many of the angels shouted for joy? Oh, all of them? Was Satan still on God's side? I used to think Satan rebelled before God created the earth, because I was taught that the earth became without form and void because of that battle. That is a supposition, and I try to resist suppositions from interpreting Scripture, and we will need to do that some. And then God talks about the oceans. In verse 8, he says, who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? Any of you moms ever have the waters break? Did you think, was that the water? No, you knew what that was. It was a big puddle if you were standing up. And actually, that's the same Hebrew word that would be for the breaking of amniotic fluid. And although the word break is in the Old Testament more than 50 times, this is the only one for that particular. It means gush, rush, like the breaking of amniotic fluid. It's interesting that God compares the sea to amniotic fluid. I remember in anatomy class, my teacher, with whom I had many conversations about evolution, he was teaching about amniotic fluid, and he said, Mrs. Bell, why do you think the amniotic fluid has about the same percentage of salt as ocean water does? Could that indicate evolution? And I said, no, That just indicates a similar saline solution by the Creator. And people do use that to try to support evolution. And then in verse 9, he says, who do you think made the cloud garment thereof, the swaddling band around a child? Children are washed off. They're no longer salted like they were in Bible times, but they are swaddled after they are washed off to keep them warm. Verse 10, he says, I break up for it my decreed place. He's talking about the ocean, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. Here is where your proud waves stop. The ocean is always moving. Have y'all seen an ocean? It's always moving, and waves are rolling in. And I remember when I was a very small child, I would see a big wave roll in and dissipate. And I thought, why doesn't that come up farther? Why doesn't it come over the land? Why does it stop in a flat place? And if you were going to build a barrier to stop something like waves, would you use sand? No. God has the barriers for the oceans. Large waves come in like a steamroller, but then they disappear at God's boundary. Ocean waves obey God. That ought to be our thought. Well, I hope Job is thinking. I know he's not talking. Verse 12 through 15, God begins talking about light and darkness. He says, Job, did you ever tell the sun to come up? Did you ever make it come up? Did you ever know exactly where it would come up? Because it does shift from our vision on earth, on the horizon. Only God can make the sun come up. Job had never had any part in that. And then he uses some poetic thought about sunlight exposing evil and restraining evil. But daily sunrises are God's pledge of ultimate victory over all darkness. And when the sun comes up, we think of crimes being committed under the cover of darkness. They lose their cover. And so some people are brazen and commit crimes in the sunlight. But most of them, especially in Job's time, were at night. I love the verse in 13 that says, sunrise takes hold of the ends of the earth that the wicked might be shaken out of it. The light exposes the wicked. And I'm probably the only woman in the world that still uses a tablecloth. But I have many memories of taking a tablecloth after a meal outside and shaking it, shaking the crumbs out of it. That's what sunlight does. It shakes the darkness out of it. Well, in light of sunrise, let me ask you a question. What is light? If any of you know, I will be astounded because I've asked every science professor I've ever had in school, what is light? The absence of darkness. How can light be the absence of something? What is darkness? Light is very mysterious. The dictionary or scientific books require it as radiant energy traveling in wavelengths that are visible to human eyes. But what is it? Science has no answer for that. Where does light come from? I put on your sheet 1 John 1:5. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. When God said, let there be light, was there a sun? The light is the essence of God, and that's why we can't describe it. And then God goes into the dimensions of the earth and the depths of the sea. Have you ever entered into the springs of the sea, or have you walked in the search of the depths? What's the deepest place in the oceans? I bet you know this. The Marianas Trench, which I think is right at 7 miles deep. And it's in my lifetime that anybody ever went down there, because they didn't have anything that could sustain the pressures of that. In fact, this is one thing I looked for and I couldn't retrieve. I found out if you throw a big rock off a ship over the Marianas Trench, it takes like 5 or 6 minutes for it to get to the bottom, which I can't even conceive of that. Now, that's not specific because I couldn't find that again. And then he talks to Job about the gates of death. He said, have they ever opened up to you? Have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? You know, us humans know very little about death because none of us in this room have experienced it. Now, I worked in an environment where they said they brought people back from death because they did not have a heartbeat. And they did CPR or stimulation electrically and brought them back. But the scripture says it's appointed to man once to die. You be very careful of what you hear of somebody who says they died, and this is what I saw, or this is what I did. One of my favorite ancient theologians, John Gill, who was born in the 1600s, said man just does not know experimentally what death is, nor do we know at what time or in what place or in what state the dead are now. There's no communication between dead people and living people. There's tricksters from Satan, but there's no communication. And we don't know if they enjoy or endure. The only glimpse we have into life after death is in Luke 16, when Jesus told about the rich man and Lazarus, both of who died. And they were conscious, and they were verbal, and one was enjoying, and one was enduring, and there was no passing between those places. So how much do we know about death? I was a nurse at a time when in the state of Tennessee an RN could declare death. For many years only a doctor could do that. And I know what death sounds like. Nothing. And then in verse 18, as if death is not enough, he says, Job, have you ever conceived of the breadth of the earth? Does anybody know the breadth of the earth? Do you know your waistline? The world has a waistline. It's called the equator. That's 25,000 miles around. Denise, have you ever traveled 5,000 miles when you traveled? Okay, you have some comprehension of how far 25,000 miles is because you've been on a 5,000-mile trip, and it'd be 4 more of those. Is that a long way? It is. But you know, even knowing the breadth of the earth, the waist of the earth, that's just one measurement. And if you take the square miles of the earth, that's 200 million. Do you think you could know that? I mean, we hardly know the square miles in Sumner County. We haven't been to all those places. We haven't seen them. Verse 19, where is the way where light dwelleth? Where is the way to where light is? And we have already mentioned at creation it was not from the sun. And for how many thousand years could people only have light from what God made? From the sun, from fire, moonlight. We could see the stars, but they don't give much light. to see what we're doing. The moon can give a lot, enough to wake you up. Look at verse 20, talking about light. Can you take the place where the light and the darkness meet? Can you go to that place? Now, we all see the sunset, and we know that it gets dark. And maybe you have seen pictures from space where the earth is turning and you see the line between sunlight and darkness. But does any human ever see that? No. Day and night is all in God's hands. The seasons, the days are longer. Friday, yay, that one's over. The longest day for this year. God manages all that. And then he talks about weather. In verses 22 and 23, the treasures of the snow are the treasures of the hail, which God is keeping against the day of battle. That's very interesting. I bet you've heard devotions about that, and I'm not going to dwell on that, but I do love snow, and I, like God, think it's a treasure. It keeps the earth from freezing any more than it would if it was not that covering, and it supplies nitrogen to the soil, which is like fertilizer. How much would it cost you to fertilize Sumner County? God has done it several times. And actually, well, I'll wait for that. Verses 24 and 25, where is the road where light is parted? Now, I don't know if that means light and darkness, where they part, how you make that line. But I have held a prism up in light and parted a ray of light, which turns into what? Rainbow. How does God hide that in light? My knees are getting weak. Verse 25, who divided the watercourse for the overflowing of waters? Who determines where water flows? If you've ever watched water flow, I have a lot of water that comes down from Carrie's house toward my house on my street. And when it gets to my mailbox, it goes uphill in my driveway and then continues down the sidewalk. Who would have thought? Come over in a rainstorm. It's amazing. Verse 26 and 27, why do I cause rain on the earth where nobody lives? On the wilderness where there's no man, to satisfy the waste ground and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth. God makes rain to grow plants that nobody ever sees. Now, I remember in science class discussing the conundrum. If a tree falls in a forest and there is no human ear to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, sound is defined as the action of sound waves on the eardrum. And that always really bothered me. But can there be some present if no one is there to hear them? And that bothered me. If a tree could fall in a forest where there was no eardrum, it would be heard by God. Because Psalm 94:9 says, does he that implanted the ear not hear? I wish I'd known that verse in science class. Well, this is strange to us. Why would God give a blessing to somewhere where there weren't people? And somebody brought this up to Jesus in Matthew 11:23 when he said to Capernaum, if the miracles had been that were done here had been done in Sodom, they would have repented. So why didn't God give Sodom miracles? Because God's methods and God's purposes we cannot understand. Now, Job's been trying to understand the purpose and the method. There's some things, ladies, we cannot understand. And I realized as I worked on this how many times I've mistaken my thoughts for God's thoughts. And I've even said, God, what were you thinking? Isaiah 55:8, God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Psalm 92:5, thy works and thy thoughts are very deep. Yes, they are. They're deeper than the deepest place in the ocean. And they're not for us to explore. Well, the next verse, 28, is very precious to me. Has the rain a father? Or who begot or fathered the drops of dew? Does the rain have a father? In a sense, it does, because it takes a grain of dust for a raindrop to form around in a cloud. And that's where we get seeding clouds. Put some dust in them. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it doesn't fall where you wanted it to fall. The rain does have a father, but who is it? It is God. And then he mentions drops of dew, which, as I thought about it, blew me away. And I want to tell you some things about dew and how dew resembles something that we all have. Dew is very powerful. There are 3 plants in the deserts of Israel that could not grow without dew, because that's 50% of their water supply for their life. This was a tremendous punishment to King Ahab when Elijah said there will be no dew or rain for 3 years.
It's amazing how much they can survive with just dew.
It is. But if dew is like the influence we have on others, you know, I'm sick of hearing people who want to be influencers. And online they would have a powerful forum. But all of us have influence, and it is coming out of us all the time, and it is very powerful. Now, dew is also silence. So is influence. You don't hear the sun come up, you don't hear corn grow, or hail, as we have had. The thing is that silent, powerful influence that I have and that you have is either sweet or sour. It's either toward God or away from God. And everyone who comes in contact with us, whether we say a word or not, receives some of our influence. Actually, I think more good is wrought by quiet influence than teaching. And dew is also very precious. When Isaac tried to give his favorite son Esau the blessing, he didn't know that it was Jacob dressed up like Esau. One of the blessings he prayed was, God, give thee the dew of heaven. And it's because dew sustains many plants. Sometimes it sustains animals when they lick the dew. But alas, let us remember dew passes away. Hosea 6:4 complains that the goodness of Israel goes away like the morning dew. And many times it did. It made me think of the power of small things. When we go to the place we love in Georgia, we go to a church sometimes called the Head of Tennessee. And the Head of Tennessee is named for a creek that is named the Head of Tennessee. And that creek flows into, there's a spring under that hill where that church is. That little stream, I mean, the stream is not that big. That goes into the Tennessee River. And it's the highest place that the Tennessee River goes. That little stream influences the Tennessee River. But where does the Tennessee River go? Into the Ohio River. Oh, bigger. Where does the Ohio River go? Mississippi. And then the ocean. That little drops of water that starts at the head of Tennessee gets all the way to the ocean. Ladies, that's what our influence is like. We don't even know that we're doing it, but we are doing it, either for godliness or for ungodliness. Verses 29 and 30, it talks about ice and frost and waters hid with a stone. That's ice over rivers. How many of you have been here since the 70s? Do you remember that winter of 78 when the schools were closed for 6 weeks and the roads were covered with ice and people drove their pickups onto the lake out at Lagardo and over by NHC because that area was like stone, like a road. Only God can do that. I have no desire to do that, but I do appreciate cool air in the summer, and I will pay a lot for it. God gave us the ability to do that. And then in verses 31 through 33, he talks about the stars and constellations. And this is so interesting. I would like to have a lesson just about these 3 verses, if I'm able to. In fact, I see that when we get through with Job, we need to have some lessons about what was in Job, whole lessons on little things. Oh, me. Well, verses 34 and 35, when rain comes, it's to God's command. Any of you have ever thrown a lightning bolt? I think I may have seen some ladies throw a lightning bolt with their voices. All this we cannot do. Now, I'm going to stop at verse 38, and I'm not going to speak to these other things, because at verse 39, God changes his topic from inanimate things like creation, light, darkness, weather. He changes from those kind of things to living things. And so we'll take the last 2 verses of this chapter next time. But I want you to think, what Job wanted to hear from God was what was going on and why this happened. And did he sin? And did God address any of those things and what we've had so far? But I think by this time, Job is feeling very small in comparison to God. I know this study made me feel this way. And the mystery that he was struggling with pushed him to know God better. And when God spoke, in fact, when Job speaks, he's going to say, I thought I knew about you. I did not know about you. And how wonderful of the God of all the universes to come speak directly to Job. I mean, I would be happy if some famous person said, oh, I want to talk to you. I would think, well, You don't know me, that's why. And God is talking to this one. Do you see how this is, God is using this even though he doesn't do what Job wanted to do, to show him what's going on? And he's on a roll, and he's just starting.